Greetings, fencers. So this is some sparring footage between Jacob and I. Jacob is a very hard-binding fighter. He'll use crown and crooked cuts more often, and is working at trying to use windings with the hangings more than hard displacing. Here I enter the bind from Shankut. When we're playing with the points, we're seeing if we can get the center line open for an easy onset. Jacob crooked cuts, then cuts as I change through and displace. I then wind to make him displace hard and run off into a squinter. I know Jacob likes to countercut the same side, so I retract to cover in my hanging. He retreats and I cut out of range. He lets it pass by so he can travel after. I step back and sweep to displace and rotate to cut him. Jacob responds by covering in his low hanging, then immediately cuts. I displace and wind into my overhanging. Jacob uses crown to displace. I use his force to run off and cut. Jacob gets out of the way with a big triangle step and uses crown to parry again. From change, I do a subtle change through and thrust. He parries in crown and I close distance and keep my hands high in order to cover. My left hand comes off to grab his arm, and when he tries to grab my sword, I dodge his hand and bop him on the head. Not a super big hit, but we don't always fight like our life depends on it.
Nice. Oh my god.
I provoke a strong bind reaction, then use a triangle step to change guard safely. Jacob releases his left hand and uses a textbook cover to close, reaching with his left hand safely. I go into a hang to trap his sword. He doesn't manage to hold and I manage to escape. He interrupts me with a crooked wrath combo that I parry in my lower hanging. Because it's on my strong, I wind up and land the thrust and strike a thwart after to stay safe. A good example of displacing and plow and winding into ox. A common exchange of ours. Thwart, thwart, wait to parry, low thwart. I see how many feints I can get away with. Jacob cuts the hands, but doesn't commit and parries the wrong side. Jacob crooked cuts my cut, so I bring my hands high to stop his second cut, then wind over his sword to thrust the neck. Jacob displaces both of my squinters. I lightly feint a thrust with a right foot increase, and as Jacob crooked cuts, I undercut, leaving my sword there to cover.
Oh, nice.
I parry Jacob's cut and crown, then wind into ox, getting light contact on his head. Jacob displaces and plow and winds into ox. I displace and try to wind over, but he pushes up and is close to getting the underslice, but doesn't commit and we separate. I flip the sword into a reverse grip and summon my courage from Enrico.
Oh, nice.
Perfect displace and plow and then wind into ox.
Oh, nice.
I change through twice. I have his weak on my strong, so I wind and thrust, but he's fast enough to move his weak and displace. I keep my hands high closing, which catches his cut. Jacob grabs my blade and lightly cuts my arm.
Oh.
Jacob cuts at my feint and I hit him with the thwart. I lead with a wind and Jacob displaces hard. I decide to stay and feel and move to parry his cut with a low hanging. My point misses and I only get a light slicing, but Jacob stops, so I did as well.
Oh god, it was flat.
I feint with a crooked to hide my intentions. In the close bind, I leave to cut around and Jacob almost gets over slicing, but again doesn't commit and focuses on getting out. My sword comes down flat and was mostly incidental contact. I change through, then pull, then feint 2 thwarts, then almost finish the second. I try to displace with a crooked, rotate and feint high, then feint low and turn into changing through and travel after, using outer taking. The point just hits and pops off, so I don't think it's good, and expect a cut, but Jacob stopped from it. Jacob binds hard and feels me go weak into hanging, and is already moving to crown to parry my next cut. He lightly hits my arm as he moves to displace my next cut and plow. He now has a good opportunity to travel after, but just threatens. I thrust an ox, closing into grapple, and hold his sword low. By now I'm too tired to go for a takedown and try to pommel strike. I can't reach, so I wrench down on his elbow to get closer. That brings my blade to his mask, and he stops.